In many high-functioning relationships, the most dangerous dynamics are not loud, but subtle. Control rarely begins with force. It begins with trust. When reality itself is slowly rewritten, the victim does not resist. They adapt. So let me ask you this. When did you first realize that your life was no longer your own?
My name is Daniel Whitmore. I am 42 years old, a financial consultant based in Westchester County, New York. I come from what most people would call old money, but I built my own career from the ground up, determined not to live in the shadow of my family's legacy. I specialize in asset structuring and wealth protection for high net worth clients, which is ironic considering what eventually happened to me. At the time this story begins, I was living in a 5-bedroom colonial house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, married with 2 children, and by all external measures, I had achieved the American dream. I met my wife, Emily, at a charity gala in Manhattan. She was elegant, composed, and disarmingly attentive. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, as if every word you said mattered. Looking back now, I understand that this was not connection, it was calibration. She was studying me, mapping my emotional patterns, identifying my values, my vulnerabilities, and most importantly, my blind spots. In the beginning, everything felt effortless. We moved in together within 6 months, which in hindsight was my first mistake. She adapted seamlessly into my life, or at least that is what I believed. She mirrored my routines, my interests, even my political views. If I liked something, she loved it. If I doubted something, she questioned it more deeply than I did. It felt like alignment, like compatibility on a rare level. What I did not realize was that I was not discovering her. I was seeing a reflection of myself. Our marriage was quiet, structured, almost too stable. There were no dramatic fights, no explosive arguments. Instead, there were small corrections, subtle shifts. She would occasionally remind me of things I supposedly said, decisions I supposedly made. At first, I brushed it off as memory lapses. I work long hours, and stress can distort recall. But over time, those moments became more frequent, more precise. She would reference conversations with exact wording, tones, even emotional context, and I would find myself unable to confidently deny them. One night, I remember coming home later than usual. I had stayed back at the office reviewing a client's portfolio before a major acquisition. Emily was sitting in the kitchen, lights dimmed, a glass of wine untouched in front of her. She looked at me with a kind of disappointment that felt rehearsed. "You said you'd be home by 7, she told me calmly. I paused. I was certain I had told her it would be a late night. "No, I didn't," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, slowly, almost sympathetically. "You've been under a lot of pressure lately," she said. "It's okay if you don't remember everything." That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because it was aggressive, but because it was dismissive in a way that made me question myself. It planted a seed, a quiet suggestion that my perception of reality might not be reliable. Over the following months, Emily began to take a more active role in our finances. At first, it made sense. She had a background in business administration, and she framed it as wanting to lighten my load. She suggested consolidating accounts, streamlining investments, even restructuring certain assets for tax efficiency. These were all things I would normally oversee myself, but I trusted her. Or more accurately, I trusted the version of her that I believed existed. She also encouraged me to take breaks, to step back from work, to spend more time at home. On the surface, it sounded supportive, but in practice, it slowly distanced me from my professional network. I declined meetings, postponed deals, delegated responsibilities, and each time I hesitated, she reassured me that I was making the right choice, that I needed balance, that my health mattered more. What I did not see at the time was the pattern. Isolation does not happen abruptly. It is engineered through comfort, through care, through the illusion of protection. There were moments when something felt off, but they were fleeting, like trying to recall a dream that dissolves the moment you wake up. I remember once reviewing a bank statement and noticing a transfer I did not recognize. It was not a large amount, but it was unusual. When I asked Emily about it, she immediately explained it as a routine allocation we had discussed weeks earlier. You agreed to this, Daniel, she said, her tone firm but not confrontational. We talked about diversifying liquidity reserves. The terminology was accurate. The logic was sound. And yet, I had no memory of that conversation. Still, I let it go. Because challenging it would mean admitting that I might be losing control not just of my finances, but of my own mind. Our social circle began to shift as well. Friends I had known for years became distant. Invitations stopped coming. Emily subtly reframed their absence as judgment. They don't understand you anymore, she told me once. You've outgrown them. It sounded flattering. It felt isolating. Looking back, the most dangerous part was not what she did, but how naturally it all unfolded. There was no single moment I could point to and say, this is where it went wrong. It was a series of small adjustments, each one reasonable on its own, but collectively they restructured my entire reality. And I let it happen because I believed I was in control, because I believed I was loved, because I never imagined that the person sleeping next to me was not building a life with me, but constructing a case against me.
Control does not need to be visible to be effective. In fact, the most dangerous form of manipulation is the one that feels like care. When someone starts editing your reality in small, consistent ways, you do not resist, you adjust. So tell me, Daniel, when did the adjustments start to feel irreversible?
If I had to pinpoint the moment things began to shift, I would say it was not a single event, but a pattern that became too consistent to ignore. At first, I rationalized everything. That is what people like me do. We analyze, we justify, we look for logical explanations, even when something feels fundamentally wrong. Emily had fully integrated herself into every aspect of my life by then. Financially, emotionally, socially, there were no boundaries left, only shared systems. And in theory, that is what a marriage is supposed to look like. But in practice, I was no longer an equal participant. I was being managed. One of the earliest changes I noticed was how she handled disagreements, or more accurately, how she avoided them. If I questioned something, anything at all, she would not argue directly. She would pause, look at me with a kind of measured concern, and then reframe the entire situation. You're not upset about this, she once told me during a discussion about a delayed investment decision. You're stressed about work, and you're projecting. That word stayed with me. Projecting. It sounded clinical, almost diagnostic. And the more she used that kind of language, the more I began to internalize it. Every emotional reaction I had was no longer valid on its own. It had to be analyzed, categorized, and often dismissed. Over time, I started second-guessing not just my decisions, but my instincts. And for someone in my profession, that is a dangerous place to be. The financial structure of our marriage also evolved in ways that, at the time, seemed efficient. Emily proposed that we create a centralized account system for transparency and optimization. It made sense. I deal with complex financial portfolios every day, and simplification is often beneficial. But what I failed to recognize was that simplification, in this case, meant consolidation of control. She gradually became the primary point of access for most of our accounts. Not through force, but through delegation. I was busy, she was available, I trusted her, that was the equation. There were documents I signed without reviewing in detail. Not because I was careless, but because I believed I understood the framework. That belief would later cost me everything. Another shift occurred in how she documented our lives. Emily had a habit of recording things, conversations, schedules, even minor disagreements. At first, it felt organized, almost impressive. She kept detailed notes, timestamps, and summaries of discussions we had. You forget things, she told me once, half joking. I just like to keep track. At the time, I laughed it off. Now, I understand that she was not documenting for clarity. She was building a narrative. There was one incident that stands out more clearly than the others. We had attended a dinner party at a colleague's house. It was a normal evening, nothing remarkable. Few drinks, casual conversation, the usual. The next morning, Emily brought it up in a way that immediately put me on edge. You were a little aggressive last night, she said calmly while making coffee. I frowned. Aggressive, how? You raised your voice at Mark, she replied. It made people uncomfortable. That did not align with my memory at all. I remembered the conversation. It was a debate about market volatility, nothing personal, nothing emotional. No, I didn't, I said, more firmly this time. She did not react defensively. Instead, she walked over to the counter, picked up her phone, and played a short audio clip. It was my voice. There was no doubt about that. The tone was sharper than I remembered, the phrasing slightly different. Out of context, it did sound confrontational. I felt something shift in that moment. Not just confusion, but a subtle loss of footing. See, she said softly, I'm not making things up. I did not know what to say. Because the evidence was there. Tangible, verifiable, but something about it felt incomplete. What happened before that, I asked. She tilted her head slightly. Does it matter? Yes, it did matter. Context always matters. But I could not prove that something was missing. I could only feel it. That was the moment I began to understand that I was no longer operating on the same version of reality as my wife. And yet, I stayed. Because leaving would mean admitting that I had been manipulated. Because staying allowed me to believe that I could still fix it. What I did not realize was that by the time you start questioning the rules of the game, you have already lost control of it. And Emily was not just playing. She was preparing.
There is a point in psychological manipulation where confusion turns into dependency. When you can no longer trust your own perception, you begin to rely on the person distorting it. That is not weakness, that is conditioning. Daniel, when did you realize you were no longer defending yourself, but asking for permission to feel?
There is a specific kind of silence that settles into your life when you stop trusting your own thoughts. It is not peaceful, it is not calm, it is controlled. By the second year of our marriage, I was no longer reacting to situations naturally. Every response I had went through a filter, one that I did not consciously install but had learned to obey. Before I spoke, before I questioned anything, there was always a pause, a calculation. Not about what was true, but about what could be defended. That was the shift. I was no longer trying to understand reality. I was trying to align with hers. Emily never raised her voice. That is something I need to make very clear. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic confrontations. If anything, her calmness made everything worse, because it positioned her as the stable one, the rational one. And by contrast, any emotional reaction from me became evidence of instability. You're getting worked up again, she would say, her tone steady, almost clinical. And I would stop mid-sentence, mid-thought. Not because I agreed, but because I was no longer sure I had the authority to disagree. One of the most defining patterns during that time was how she handled memory. Not just correcting mine, but replacing it. There was an evening I remember with unusual clarity, perhaps because it was one of the last times I trusted my own version of events without hesitation. We were discussing a potential investment property in Connecticut. It was a straightforward decision. The numbers made sense. The risk was manageable. And I was ready to move forward. I think we should proceed, I said, laying out the projections. Emily listened, nodding slowly. Then she asked a few questions, nothing out of the ordinary. The conversation ended without conflict. 2 days later, she brought it up again, but in a completely different frame. I've been thinking about what you said, she began, standing by the kitchen island, about how you didn't feel comfortable with the risk. I looked at her, confused. That's not what I said. She didn't react immediately. She let the silence stretch just enough to make me uncomfortable. Daniel, she said softly, you were very clear. You said it didn't feel right. I felt a tightening in my chest. Not anger? Not yet. Something closer to disorientation. No, I insisted. I said the opposite. She exhaled slowly, as if bracing herself. This is what I mean, she said. You've been doing this a lot lately. Doing what? Rewriting conversations? Or remembering them correctly? The problem was, I could not prove either. And that was the trap. From that point on, every discussion became unstable. Not because of disagreement, but because of uncertainty. I started documenting things myself. Notes, emails, timestamps, small attempts to anchor reality. Emily noticed. You don't trust me, she said one evening, her voice quiet, almost hurt. That statement carried weight, not because it was true or false, but because of what it implied. In a marriage, trust is not just expected, it is required. Questioning her version of events was no longer just a cognitive act, it was a moral one. It's not about trust, I replied, though even as I said it, I could hear the weakness in my own argument. Then what is it about? She asked. I did not have an answer that would not make me sound irrational, so I stopped trying. Around that time, I also began to notice changes in how others interacted with me. Subtle at first, a colleague hesitating before agreeing with me, a client asking for clarification on something I was certain I had already explained clearly. It was as if a narrative had begun to circulate quietly without my awareness. One afternoon, I received a call from a junior associate at my firm. His tone was cautious, almost rehearsed. Daniel, I just wanted to check in, he said. There's been some concern about communication on the Henderson account. Concern? What kind of concern? I asked. Just inconsistencies, he replied. Different instructions, different directions. It's probably nothing, but I thought you should know. I ended the call and sat there for a long time, staring at my desk. Inconsistencies. That word again. It was no longer confined to my home. It was spreading. That evening, I confronted Emily. Not aggressively, not emotionally, but directly. Have you spoken to anyone at my firm? I asked. She looked at me genuinely surprised, or at least convincingly so. Why would I do that? She replied. It was a fair question, and that was the problem. Everything she did was defensible. Every move had plausible deniability. I don't know, I admitted. Things just feel off. She stepped closer, placing a hand lightly on my arm. You've been under a lot of pressure, she said. Maybe it's time to talk to someone, a professional. There it was, not an accusation, a suggestion, wrapped in concern. But the implication was clear. The problem was not the situation. The problem was me. And for the first time, a part of me believed it. I started therapy shortly after that, not because I thought I needed it, but because I needed to eliminate the possibility that she was right, that I was losing control. The therapist asked me simple questions about stress, about work, about my marriage. I answered honestly, but even then, I found myself editing my responses, filtering them through Emily's voice. Well, my wife thinks I might be overreacting, I said at one point. And what do you think? The therapist asked. I hesitated. That hesitation was the answer, because I no longer knew. By the time you outsource your sense of reality to someone else, you are no longer participating in your own life. You are observing it. And Emily was no longer just influencing the narrative. She was writing it. What I did not understand then was that this was not just psychological. It was strategic, because while I was busy questioning myself, she was preparing the world to question me too.
When psychological manipulation is done well, it does not stay private. It scales. The narrative built behind closed doors eventually seeks validation in public spaces. And when that space is a courtroom, perception becomes evidence. Daniel, what did it feel like to watch your private reality become a public accusation?
The first time I realized something was truly wrong, not just emotionally but legally, was not during an argument, not during one of those quiet distortions of reality inside our home. It was a Tuesday morning. I remember because I had a meeting scheduled with a long-term client, one of the few relationships I had managed to maintain despite everything. I was reviewing documents in my office when my assistant knocked on the door, her expression unusually tense. There's someone here to see you, she said. Who? I asked, not looking up from the file. She hesitated. They said it's official. That word should have meant something immediately, but it didn't, not yet. When I stepped out into the reception area, I saw a man standing there, mid-40s, neutral expression, holding a folder. He introduced himself quickly, professionally, process server, and then he handed me the documents. At first, I didn't fully register what I was reading. The words were familiar individually, but together, they formed something that felt completely detached from my reality. Petition for divorce, requests for full custody, allegations of emotional and psychological abuse, financial misconduct. I remember reading my own name multiple times, as if repetition would somehow make it more comprehensible. It didn't. What is this? I asked, though the answer was already in my hands. The man simply nodded. "You've been served." That was it. No explanation, no context. Just a formal acknowledgement that something had already been set in motion. I called Emily immediately. She didn't answer. I called again and again. Nothing. By the time she finally returned the call, hours later, her voice was calm, too calm. "I think it's best if we let the lawyers handle this," she said. Handle this, as if this was a mutual disagreement, as if I had any idea what was happening. "Emily, what is this?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. "It's what needs to happen," she replied. "This isn't working anymore." That sentence in any other context might have sounded like the end of a marriage. But here, it was something else entirely. It was the beginning of a case. "I don't understand," I said. "Where is this coming from?" There was a pause. Not long, but deliberate. "You know exactly where this is coming from," she said quietly. No, I didn't. But the way she said it made it sound like I should. That was the first moment I felt it. Not confusion, not doubt, but fear. Real, grounded fear, because I was being accused of something I did not recognize. And yet, part of me was already questioning whether I had somehow missed it. The legal process moved quickly, faster than I expected. Within days, there were temporary orders in place, restrictions, limitations. I was asked to leave the house. Not suggested, ordered. Standing in the driveway, looking at the place I had lived in for years, the place I thought I had built, I felt something fracture internally. Not just loss, but displacement, as if I had been removed from my own life. The first court hearing was surreal. There is no other word for it. I sat there, listening as Emily's attorney presented a version of our marriage that was both detailed and unrecognizable. Specific dates, specific incidents, patterns of behavior that painted a consistent picture. A picture of me, but not the man I knew myself to be. "He exhibits controlling tendencies," the attorney stated. "There is a documented pattern of emotional instability and financial coercion." Documented. That word again. Emily took the stand. She spoke calmly, clearly, without hesitation. Her tone was measured, her expressions appropriate. There were moments where her voice softened, where it broke just enough to suggest emotion without losing control. It was convincing, more than convincing. It was structured. Every statement aligned with the next. Every example reinforced the narrative. There were no contradictions, no gaps, because it had been prepared carefully over time. Then came the evidence. Audio recordings, emails, financial documents, all presented in a way that supported her claims. I listened to recordings of my own voice, stripped of context, framed as aggression. I saw emails I had written selectively highlighted to imply intent that was never there. I reviewed financial transfers that on paper looked irregular, but in reality were part of normal asset movement. Individually, each piece could be explained. Together, they formed a story, and that story was not in my favor. My attorney did what he could. He challenged inconsistencies, questioned timelines, attempted to introduce context. But context is weak when the narrative is strong. And Emily's narrative was airtight. At one point, the judge looked at me not with hostility, but with concern. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "have you considered undergoing a psychological evaluation?" There it was. Not just a legal battle, a psychological one. Validated. In that moment, everything aligned. The therapy, the documentation, the subtle shifts in perception. This was never spontaneous. This was built, and I had been living inside it the entire time. I wanted to stand up, to explain, to break down every detail, every distortion. But I couldn't, because every attempt I made to defend myself sounded exactly like what they had described. Defensive, erratic, unstable. So I sat there, silent, listening to my life being rewritten in real time. And for the first time, I understood something with absolute clarity. I was not just losing the case. I was losing the narrative. And without that, I had nothing left to stand on.
There is a difference between losing a case and losing your identity. When the world accepts a version of you that you do not recognize, the damage is no longer external, it becomes internal. People often ask how someone survives that kind of collapse. The real question is, what is left of you after it happens?
Losing everything does not happen in a single moment. It happens in layers. First, it is the house, then the accounts, then the routines, and finally the people. By the time the court finalized its initial rulings, I was no longer living in Westchester. I had moved into a temporary rental, a small furnished apartment about 40 minutes away from my old neighborhood. It was the kind of place designed for short-term stays, neutral, impersonal, as if it expected you not to belong there for long. That detail stayed with me because I no longer belonged anywhere. The custody arrangement was the part that broke something in me that I did not know could break. Supervised visits, limited hours, structured interaction, scheduled fatherhood. I remember the first time I saw my children after the ruling. It was in a designated visitation center. Bright lights, neutral furniture, a staff member present at all times. My son did not run toward me. He hesitated. That hesitation was worse than rejection. It meant uncertainty. And children do not develop uncertainty on their own. It is taught. "Hi, Dad," he said, his voice polite, controlled, polite, controlled. Words that should never describe a child greeting their parent. My daughter stayed closer to the supervisor, her eyes moving between us, as if trying to understand what version of me she was supposed to believe. I knelt down, forcing a smile that felt disconnected from everything inside me. "Hey," I said softly, "I missed you." They nodded, but they did not say it back. That was the moment I realized that whatever narrative had been built in court had not stayed in court. It had followed them home. Financially, the damage was precise, not chaotic, not reckless, calculated. Accounts had been restructured in ways that legally placed control outside of my immediate reach. Joint assets had been reinterpreted under claims of mismanagement. Certain transfers, which I had approved without scrutiny, were now framed as evidence of concealment. My own expertise had been turned against me. There was a specific kind of irony in being a financial consultant who cannot access his own money. But irony does not pay legal fees. I had to liquidate personal holdings just to maintain the case. Assets that had nothing to do with the marriage, but were now necessary for survival. And even then, it was not enough. Clients began to withdraw. Not all at once, but gradually. A call not returned, a contract not renewed, a meeting postponed indefinitely. Reputation does not collapse loudly. It erodes quietly, one conversation at a time. I heard things, not directly, never directly, but enough to understand. Concerns about stability, questions about judgment, unpredictable behavior. Words that had been introduced in court were now circulating in my professional life. The narrative had expanded. I stopped going into the office regularly. Not because I could not, but because every interaction felt like a test I was already failing. Every glance carried a question. Every silence felt like confirmation. Isolation is different when it is chosen versus when it is assigned. This was assigned. There were nights when I sat in that apartment surrounded by furniture that did not belong to me, trying to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led me there. Not emotionally, but logically. I treated my own life like a case study. Timeline, decisions, variables. But every time I thought I had identified the turning point, it dissolved under scrutiny. Because the truth was, there was no single failure. There was a system, and I had participated in it. That realization was difficult to accept. Not because it meant I was guilty of what I was accused of, but because it meant I had enabled the conditions that made it possible. Trust without verification, delegation without oversight, silence in the face of discomfort. These were not crimes, but they were vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities in the wrong hands become leverage. I continued therapy at first out of necessity, then out of something closer to desperation. I needed someone to tell me that I was not what they said I was. But therapy does not work that way. It does not validate. It reflects. "And what do you believe?" the therapist asked me again, weeks into the process. That question should have been simple. It wasn't, because belief requires a foundation, and mine had been dismantled. "I don't know," I admitted. That was the most honest answer I had given in months. There's a moment when you lose enough, where survival stops being about reclaiming what you had and starts being about understanding what is real. For me, that moment came not with anger, not with determination, but with clarity. A quiet, unsettling clarity. This was not over, not because I wanted revenge, but because something did not align. The precision of it, the timing, the structure of the evidence, it was too consistent, too prepared. And that kind of preparation does not begin at the moment of conflict. It begins long before, which meant one thing. What I had experienced was not a breakdown of a marriage. It was the execution of a plan. And if it was a plan, then there would be traces, patterns, connections, things that existed before me. And if I could find those, then maybe I could find my way back, not to what I lost, but to what actually happened.
When something is engineered over time, it carries a history. Patterns do not emerge in isolation. They repeat. And when you stop asking, why me, and start asking, who else, the narrative begins to fracture. Daniel, what did you find when you stopped looking at the present and started investigating the past?
The shift did not feel dramatic. There was no moment of sudden clarity, no breakthrough that changed everything overnight. It was quieter than that, more methodical. I stopped asking emotional questions and started asking structural ones. If what happened to me was a plan, then it had a beginning. And if it had a beginning, then it existed before I became part of it. That thought stayed with me, not as a theory, as a direction. I began with the simplest place, Emily's past. Not the version she told me, the version that could be verified. At the time we met, she presented herself as someone with a modest background, a business administration degree, a few years of mid-level corporate experience, nothing particularly remarkable. No major red flags, no obvious inconsistencies, but I had never looked closely because I never had a reason to. Now I did. I reached out to a private investigator, not through my usual professional network, but through a contact I trusted outside of my immediate circle. Discretion mattered. The request was simple: background verification, employment history, financial records, where accessible, anything that did not align. The first report came back clean, too clean. That was the problem. In my line of work, everyone has some irregularity, a gap in employment, a minor legal issue, a financial discrepancy, something. Emily had none. It was as if her history had been curated. That was the first real signal. So I went deeper. I asked the investigator to expand the search. Different states, previous addresses, old records that might not appear in standard databases. It took time, weeks. And during that time, I maintained my routine, limited as it was: therapy, legal consultations, occasional supervised visits with my children. On the surface, nothing changed. Underneath, everything was moving. The second report was different. Not dramatic, but specific. There was a name, not Emily Whitmore, Emily Carter, connected to an address in Illinois, 10 years before I met her. That alone was not unusual. People change names, marriage, divorce, personal reasons, but there was no record of a marriage that would explain it. That inconsistency led to another, a civil case filed under that name. The details were limited at first. Sealed records, partial information, but the nature of the case was clear enough. Financial dispute, allegations of misrepresentation. The case had been settled out of court, no formal judgment, no public conclusion, just closed. I felt something tighten in my chest as I read through the summary, not because it proved anything, but because it felt familiar. Too familiar. I pushed further. More requests, more digging. And then a pattern began to emerge. Different states, different names, similar structures, short-term relationships, shared financial arrangements, disputes, and then exit. Clean, controlled, contained. I was not the first. I was part of a sequence. That realization did not bring relief. It brought precision. because if this had happened before, then it had been refined, improved, optimized. What I experienced was not a first attempt. It was a perfected model. I sat in my apartment, documents spread across the table, connecting points that had existed long before I entered the picture, names, dates, transactions, each one small on its own, together undeniable. And then I saw it, not in a document, not in a report, but in the structure itself. Emily did not just manipulate people. She built cases preemptively. She created situations where her version of events would always have more evidence, more documentation, more apparent consistency. She did not react to conflict. She prepared for it. That meant one thing. Everything I had experienced during our marriage, the recordings, the notes, the financial restructuring, the subtle isolation, it was not adaptation. It was execution. I was never being understood. I was being profiled. The final piece came from a source I did not expect. An email from someone I did not know. The subject line was simple. I think we need to talk. I hesitated before opening it, not out of fear, but because I already had a sense of what it might contain. The message was brief, direct. My name is Andrew. I believe I was married to the same woman you are describing. I read that line more than once, not because I did not understand it, but because it confirmed everything I had started to see. He included a number, no explanation, no elaboration, just an invitation. I did not call immediately. I sat there, looking at the phone, feeling something I had not felt in a long time. Not anger, not confusion, clarity. Because for the first time since this began, the narrative was no longer one-sided. There was another version, another witness, another structure. And if two independent experiences aligned, then it was no longer a personal failure. It was a system. I picked up the phone and I dialed. That call did not give me closure. It gave me direction. Because what Andrew told me, what he had documented, what he had lost was not just similar to my story. It was nearly identical. Same patterns, same strategies, same outcomes, different names, different timelines, same result. And in that moment, the question was no longer whether I had been manipulated. That was already clear. The question was, how far did this go? And more importantly, how do you dismantle something that was designed to survive exposure?
Revenge, when driven by emotion, is chaotic. But when it is driven by clarity, it becomes strategy. The most effective counter to manipulation is not exposure. It is precision. Daniel, when you finally understood the system, how did you decide where to strike?
I did not act immediately after speaking with Andrew. That would have been a mistake. Emotion was still present, even if I did not feel it as strongly as before. And any action taken too early, too visibly, would have played directly into the narrative Emily had already established. Unstable, reactive, unpredictable. I could not afford to confirm that version of me, so I waited. And while I waited, I built, not a defense, a counterstructure. Andrew and I met in person 2 weeks after that first call. Neutral location, no records, no assumptions. He was older than me by a few years, but the fatigue in his expression was something I recognized immediately. Not physical exhaustion, something deeper, the kind that comes from having your reality dismantled and then dismissed. We did not spend much time exchanging personal details. We did not need to. The patterns aligned too closely. Instead, we focused on documentation, what he had, what I had, what overlapped, and more importantly, what did not, because the gaps were where the truth lived. Emily's strength had always been control of narrative through selective completeness. She never fabricated entire realities. She curated them, removed context, inserted structure, which meant that her system, as precise as it was, depended on one critical assumption, that no one would compare versions. That assumption was no longer valid. We began reconstructing timelines, parallel timelines. His relationship with her, mine, different years, different states, same sequence, initial connection, rapid integration, financial consolidation, psychological reframing, documentation, conflict, legal action, exit. It was not just similar, it was identical in architecture. Once we mapped it out, the next step became clear. We did not need to prove she was lying. We needed to prove she was repeating. Patterns hold more weight than contradictions, especially in legal contexts. I brought in a forensic accountant, not someone connected to my previous work, someone external with no prior exposure to my case. Objectivity mattered. We fed him the data, not conclusions, just information, transactions, account movements, asset shifts across timelines, different names, different entities, same structural behavior. It took him less than a week to identify something I had suspected but could not formally articulate. These aren't isolated financial decisions, he said. This is a strategy. Repeated asset positioning followed by controlled dispute. That statement changed everything because it translated experience into language the legal system could understand. Strategy, pattern, intent. We were no longer presenting a personal grievance. We were outlining a system of behavior. The legal approach shifted from defense to offense. Carefully, deliberately. We did not reopen my case immediately. That would have been too direct. Instead, we began with something smaller, a civil inquiry, focused not on my situation alone, but on a broader pattern of financial conduct under multiple identities. That triggered something we anticipated: pressure, not legal, behavioral. Emily reached out. For the first time since the court proceeding, she contacted me directly. The message was simple: I think we should talk. I read it several times. Not because I was unsure what it meant, but because of what it revealed. She had noticed, not the evidence itself, the shift in direction. I did not respond immediately. Timing at this stage was everything. When I did reply, it was controlled, neutral. No, I don't think that's necessary. That was it. No accusation, no engagement, just absence. Because engagement is what she understood, what she controlled, what she expected. This was different. And difference creates uncertainty. We continued building the case quietly, expanding beyond Andrew and myself. There were others, not all willing to come forward, but enough to establish consistency. Each story added weight, not emotionally, structurally. The legal team began preparing a motion, not to argue innocence, but to challenge the integrity of the original narrative. That distinction mattered. We were not asking the court to believe me. We were asking it to question her. That is a different standard and a more achievable one. The final step was the most delicate: timing the reveal. Too early, and it would be dismissed as retaliation. Too late, and the damage would be irreversible. We chose precision. A single filing, comprehensive, documented, cross-referenced across multiple cases, identities, and financial patterns. Not aggressive, unavoidable. I remember the moment it was submitted, there was no sense of victory, no surge of satisfaction, just stillness. Because this was not about winning, it was about correction. For the first time since everything began, I was no longer reacting to her system, I was operating outside of it. And systems, no matter how well designed, do not function well when they are no longer in control of the environment they depend on. Emily had built something efficient, effective, resilient, but she had built it under one assumption: that she would always control the narrative. Now, for the first time, she didn't.
Closure is often misunderstood as justice. But in cases like this, justice is not emotional, it is structural. It does not restore what was lost, it redefines what is true. So Daniel, after everything was exposed, what did it actually give you back?
The hearing that followed was nothing like the first. Not in tone, not in structure, and most importantly, not in control. The same courtroom, the same system, but a completely different narrative environment. This time, the case was not built on isolated claims or emotional testimony. It was constructed on patterns, cross-referenced timelines, independent accounts, financial structures that repeated with a level of consistency that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Emily was there. Of course she was, composed, as always. But something had changed. It was subtle. The way she held still just a fraction longer than necessary. The way her responses, while still controlled, lacked the seamless continuity they once had. Because for the first time, she was not presenting a story. She was responding to one. And that difference matters. Her attorney attempted to maintain the original framing. Focus on my alleged behavior. Reinforce the established narrative. But the court was no longer anchored to that version. Because now there were multiple versions. Aligned, consistent, independent. Andrew testified. Calm, precise. He did not exaggerate. He did not speculate. He simply described. And as he spoke, I watched the structure begin to shift. Not collapse, shift. Because systems like this do not break instantly. They destabilize first. The forensic accountant followed. He did not speak about emotions. He spoke about movement, funds, timing, repetition, language the court understands, language that does not depend on belief, only on verification. Then came the documentation. Side-by-side comparisons, different names, different years, same behavioral architecture. At that point, it was no longer about credibility. It was about probability. And the probability that all of this was coincidental was effectively zero. Emily took the stand again. For the first time, I saw something I had never seen before. Not fear, not panic, calculation under pressure. She adjusted quickly, she always did, but adjustment requires time. And this time, the pace was not hers to control. There were questions she could not answer without contradiction, gaps she could not bridge without creating new inconsistencies. And for someone whose entire system depended on controlled coherence, inconsistency was exposure. The ruling did not come immediately. It rarely does. But when it did, it was not dramatic. No raised voices, no final declarations, just language. Measured, deliberate. The court acknowledged the existence of a pattern of behavior that directly impacted the integrity of the original case. That was enough. The prior ruling was not erased, but it was challenged, reopened, reevaluated, which, in legal terms, is as close to reversal as reality allows. Financial restrictions were lifted, access restored, not instantly, but definitively. Custody arrangements were amended, not completely, but meaningfully. Supervision removed, time expanded, trust cautiously reintroduced. As for Emily, there were consequences, not theatrical, not immediate, but structural. Investigations into financial conduct, review of prior cases, the kind of scrutiny that does not disappear, the kind that follows. People often ask me if it felt like victory. It didn't. Victory implies gain. This was not gain. This was correction. I did not get back the years. I did not get back the moments with my children that were filtered through doubt. I did not get back the version of myself that existed before all of this. What I got back was something quieter, but more stable, clarity, not just about what happened, but about how it happened. And more importantly, how easily it can happen. The last time I saw Emily was not in court. It was outside, brief, unplanned. She looked at me, not with anger, not with regret, but with recognition, as if, for the first time, she understood that I was no longer part of her system. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say, because whatever this was, it was no longer a relationship. It was a closed structure, and I had stepped out of it completely. If there is one thing I learned from all of this, it is that truth does not win by being louder. It wins by being organized. And manipulation does not fail because it is wrong. It fails when it can no longer control the context in which it exists. Justice, at least in my case, was not about proving her wrong. It was about removing her ability to define what was right. And once that was gone, everything else followed